Hello everybody, Oliver here, and welcome to, well, something a bit different for my channel, I think. Yeah, I have finally stooped to the level of the most base and cliche thing you can do on YouTube, and I have created a tier list. Now, it's not just any tier list, it's a tier list of every novel written by Kurt Vonnegut Jr. Why have I made a tier list of every novel written by Kurt Vonnegut Jr.? Well, the short of it is that over the past 6 months, I have read all of them, all 14 of them. And this was driven by me reading one in particular prior to that. Well, I'd read two prior to that, but it was the second one of them I read that I decided, I need to make a video essay on this one. So in order to do research for that, I thought I should get inside Kurt Vonnegut's head. And I don't think I can really say that with a straight face unless I have read pretty much everything he's ever written. So here we are, 6 months later, I have read all of them. That video essay is still in production. At the current stage, it's just different bits of the script that I somehow need to graft together and fill out a bit into something a bit more coherent. So I don't want to get your hopes up too much. It's still a few months away. But yeah, it's coming. And in the meantime, I thought as kind of a preview for that, and also a way to talk about some of the novels that I wouldn't get to talk about in that video, I would create this video here that's a tier list. I'm going to explain them. I'm going to rank them. It is going to be longer than 10 minutes. The title is a joke. It's the joke that Kurt Vonnegut would have wanted me to make. It also got won a unanimous vote on my Discord. So, once it done that, there was no going back. I have no idea how long this is actually going to take. So, stick with me and we'll see what happens. But yeah, I'm going to go through, rank them. I'll try to avoid major spoilers. There will probably be minor spoilers here and there. So if you want to go in with like a completely blank slate, then stop watching now. But I think, I can explain some of the novels, explain what I liked about them, explain what I didn't like about some of them. And I think I can get away with that without spoiling too much. So we'll see as we go on. Hopefully that is the case. And before we start, I should mention that this collection of covers for the novels here is rather a special one. So it's surprisingly hard to find coherent sets of covers for every novel by Vonnegut. And this one, I think you'll agree, is every single one of them is absolutely beautiful. And these were created by, I think it was Milk and Bone Design, for the centenary of Vonnegut's birth, which was in 2022. Fun fact, where do you think that centenary was held? Was it in Indianapolis? No. Was it in New York? No. Was it in Cape Cod? No. Was it anywhere in the United States? No. It was in Plymouth, which is in the UK. I just find that really funny. I don't know why the Kurt Vonnegut centenary was celebrated in Plymouth, but I love that it was. And these covers were created as kind of a publicity thing for that, as I said, by Milk and Bone Design. You can also get them as prints. I have ordered a print of my favourite novel, which we'll get to when we get to it. So yeah, I'll put a link to that in the description if you'd like to get some of them yourself. But I thought, it's a coherent set of all the covers. They're really beautiful designs, so might as well use them here. All right, and I guess, also before we start, a rule of thumb for this tier list. So, I would not say there are any bad novels here. There are some that I don't think I would want to read again. I don't regret reading any of them, but I think, my threshold for wanting to read a novel again here would be a B, I think. If anything B or above, I want to read again at some point. And some of them I have read twice. I have read two of these novels prior to my blitz through them over the past 6 months. And we'll get to those when we get to them. But yeah, the rest of them, I read them all in one blur over 6 months, sometimes more quickly than others. But yeah, I think that definitely influenced my opinion of these. And I should emphasize that this is all going to be opinion-based. So, you feel free to disagree. I think in general, a lot of my ranking kind of lines up with the consensus on which are his better novels and which are his worst. But there are some outliers, and I think they're interesting ones. So we'll get to those as we get to them. Now, I did have to ask myself when I was deciding to do this. How am I going to order these? Do I go through them, in the order they were written, as they're lined up here? Do I go through them from how, the most famous to the least famous, or vice versa? Do I go through them in a Vonnegut-esque order of starting at the end and then going back to the beginning and then flitting through all the rest in some random middle? In the end, I decided just to go the obvious way, which is worst to best, just because, that's going to build some tension and you're going to have to wait to find out which is actually the best and which is actually the one I will be making a video on. So let's start with, unfortunately, the worst. And I don't think I will be alone in considering this. I think Vonnegut himself said this as well. So in D tier, we begin with Slapstick. Now, Slapstick, when was this published? I have the notes here somewhere. Slapstick was published in 1976, and it tells the tale of the King of New York in a dystopian future, who was previously the President of the United States, and it tells his life story. It tells how he grew up with his sister in a big mansion without parents, and everything that came about, through their own intelligence, through their lack of intelligence, and so on. And it's a very strange. It's a strange book. I mean, if you're not familiar with any Vonnegut, strange could describe a lot of them. But Slapstick in particular seemed a bit off to me. And I think I should emphasize here that there's often a lot of themes and content going on in Vonnegut novels that overlap in a lot of ways. And in some cases that seems to work, in some cases it seems not to. And I think a lot of it is because it's to do with how that particular theme kind of connects with your mind. And some of these, have a similar thing going on, where there's lots of different things going on that don't really seem to make a lot of sense to put together. But for some reason, they just dug right into my brain, and I understood what was going on completely from a thematic perspective. But Slapstick, unfortunately, did not really do that. And I think that was influenced a bit by, the title of Slapstick. You would imagine that's got something to do with humour. And Vonnegut, of course, famous for being quite a humorous writer, even. But I failed to see the connection. Maybe someone could explain it to me in the comments, but I failed to really see the inherent humour in the situation that is being depicted in this novel. As I said, it's a tale of the former president of the United States in a dystopia where the United States has collapsed due to various crises that happen, some under his tenure, some not. It's ostensibly about loss as well. I think my favourite part of the novel is actually the prologue, where Vonnegut describes how he lost his sister, who died of cancer, and that set me up for thinking that this was going to be quite a heartfelt novel and have a lot of personal connections. And maybe I wasn't engaged enough. Maybe I just missed them, but I didn't really get that sense from it. I know some people do. I know some people really like it. I think they are in the minority, though. As I said, Vonnegut himself ranked this as his weakest novel. But yeah, it didn't really do it for me, I'm afraid. There were some bits I liked. So I think it gives a good perspective and a good commentary on kind of the paranoia in the United States around the 70s and 80s around the rise of China. In particular, I found that quite funny, the way that satirised that. And of course, the page-to-page prose is still Vonnegut for the most part. It's still, every now and then, it got a chuckle out of me. So there's not nothing here, right? It's just, it felt incoherent in a way that a lot of Vonnegut novels should be, but aren't, if that makes sense. So unfortunately, I am going to have to leave that in D tier, as the only novel in D tier. So the only way is up from here. Moving on then to C tier, and which novel, in my opinion, gets the dishonourable honour of being the least best novel in C tier? Well, in my opinion, that is going to go to Hocus Pocus. So I will slot that in there. Now, Hocus Pocus. On some level, the story is quite simple. It's about a Vietnam veteran called Eugene Debs Hartke, who he gets a job working as a teacher in quite a prestigious school, so a very elite school. He's then fired from that job, gets a job working at a prison that's across the lake from that school, and then witnesses a prison break. That's all the prisoners get out and kind of lay siege to the school. So it's kind of, it alternates between the two settings of that prison and the school, and there's lots of flashbacks to Vietnam and other events in the character's life. And it touches on a lot of themes that are definitely pertinent to the 90s when it was written. So it was written or published in 1990. So that there's a lot of stuff about the prison industrial complex, black disenfranchisement, the elitism of the school, and kind of the history behind it, and why it's so elite, and how it got to that status. And I think all of those themes are, they have merit, and I think Vonnegut does a good job at highlighting some of those issues. But I think this is one that it was too long for me. I'm sorry to say, it was too long, and the plot was, even though it's simple, it was just told in a very difficult manner to digest, I think. And I think this is perhaps a more general thing about Vonnegut as well. And maybe I wouldn't have felt this so much if I hadn't read all of the novels in sequence. But I began to get quite tired towards the end of this style of, just describing everything that happens at the end, at the beginning, and drip feeding some more details about that as it goes on, but not really at a rate that's fast enough to, make do with kind of a lot of the background that happens. So spends a lot of time at the start talking about the history of the school, and there's a lot of names that are thrown at you. It was difficult for me to keep track of it all, really, and to see how it really bore much influence on what was happening in the main plot. I think it did get better as it went on. Towards the end, there was more stuff happening, and it kind of drew a lot more things together at the end. It got quite emotional at the end, actually. I think the story, particularly of there's a Japanese character in it who is the warden of the prison, and his story and the way his story ends, I found quite poignant. So as I said, there's stuff to it. I think it talks about good things, but it didn't really come together for me, and it felt quite a chore to get through, I'm afraid. So unfortunately, I've had to put it at this low rating. Joining it in C tier, in my opinion, we have Jailbird. And it's definitely not C tier based on the artwork from this cover collection. I think this is one of my favourites. But yeah, the novel itself, it's okay. It's only okay for me, I'm afraid. So Jailbird, what is it? So it tells the story of a man who plays a very minor role in the Watergate scandal. So that was, the crimes perpetrated by American President Richard Nixon. And he goes to jail for that. And then it's, kind of describes what happens after he gets out of jail. And then he recounts a lot of the events he was party to before that. And then the events that happen afterwards. So I think perhaps my expectation of this, again, it's one that I went in with the wrong expectations for. So I have the Library of America editions of all of these novels. So that's how I got all 14 of them. That's how I've been reading them since then. And, they're all professionally bound and so forth. It's a very nice collection. And it gives the tagline of each of them on the blurb, the inside cover and so forth. And the tagline it had for Jailbird was something along the lines of, it tells a story of a man who is involved in every American scandal from such and such to Watergate. And I apologise for my interpretation of that, which is I thought it was going to be Vonnegut's Forrest Gump. And I thought I was going to see how he would take a character through a load of zany situations that are real events that we know, and kind of put them in the background of those events and move them through those. And it didn't really turn out like that. Like, obviously, there's an involvement in the Watergate scandal. That's some of the characters and events in that are semi-fictionalized in this novel as opposed to the real ones. But the other events, I I don't know. Were they real? Were they fictional? I think it's a mix of both. And as someone who's not American, hello, I'm not American. As someone who's not American, it's quite difficult for me to separate what was real from the fictional things. And perhaps that wasn't a bad thing, but it did make it difficult for me to kind of put these events in context and see what was actually going on with them, if that makes sense. And I think a lot of my problem with this book was, again, the way it was structured. So it starts with this character leaving prison after his jail sentence. And then it spends most of the rest of it with him reminiscing about the events that happened before. And it did kind of feel like the whole thing was a bit in stasis while that was happening. It was just a character talking about the past while he was just walking around. I think the actual events of the novel, as it could be said, take place over the course of maybe 1 or 2 or 3 days. There's not a lot that actually happens in real time. And I definitely found myself feeling like I want this to go on. I want to see what's actually happening in the present. So again, this was perhaps another casualty of me reading too much Vonnegut in too short a time. And perhaps I would have been a bit more resistant to that in other circumstances. In terms of the actual themes of this, again, I think they're all admirable. So it talks about the American labor movement quite a bit. It talks about socialism, capitalism, what is happening to the capitalism in America at the time it was written. When was it written? It was written in 1979. So it's definitely got that kind of a 80s feel to it, of American economic policy is becoming a bit too much of a beast for its own good. And there's a nice, I won't spoil it, but there is a nice way that is satirized at the end of the novel, with kind of the goal of the main character's, one of his former lovers. And I found her story quite nice. So she ends up relatively destitute, not relatively, like absolutely destitute, after the main character comes out of prison, and seeing what's happened to her and what her ideals are was quite nice. But yeah, again, it was one that was quite slow, and it was difficult for me to fit it into context of what those events were and what they meant. And I could do kind of it, like, you can't spend any time on the internet these days without knowing about some history of the American labor movement. So I know, I knew bits and pieces, but it still felt quite distant from what I understood. So unfortunately, I think Jailbird is C tier for me. Moving on then to B tier. And as I said at the start, this is kind of the threshold at which, every book from here onwards, I would like to read again someday, just because I think there's enough thematic material that resonated with me that I'd like to explore it a bit further, or whether, maybe it was just a fun book. But unfortunately, there has to be a worst of these books, and that, in my opinion, is Player Piano. Player Piano, Player Piano. So what is Player Piano? Well, it holds a couple of distinctions as far as Vonnegut's novels are concerned. So first off, it was his first novel, written in 1952. It's also, I think, by a crude page count that I did, his longest one, at 300 pages. And a lot of people, when they rank Vonnegut's novels or talk about Vonnegut's novels, they tend to separate this one as kind of proto-Vonnegut. It's not him yet. And I think that's a bit harsh. I think any description of this as generic is quite harsh. It's definitely conventional. It's a lot more conventional than a lot of his other books. So we just have a character who goes through a journey to learn some new things about his world. By the end, we follow that linearly. The prose is quite restrained. It's not playing. It's not as playful in a lot of ways that Vonnegut became later on. So I can see where they're coming from, but I still think any description of this as just standard run-of-the-mill sci-fi is not accurate, really. So yeah, I suppose I should explain what it's actually about. So it's set in a near-future United States of America, where following World War III, where machines were invented and then deployed to win that war, machines have now been taken home and applied in more domestic settings. So, everything really is automated. Most of the population doesn't really have meaningful jobs. It's just a small cabal of managers and engineers who really run the place. And so it's talking about the impact of automation on people's lives, automation on how valuable they find themselves, their value in society. So that there's a lot in here that felt quite difficult to read at the moment, given some things that are happening, without wishing to get into too much detail. But I think it's that kind of thing. It's quite prescient in a lot of ways. And that's not to say it was completely original. So the idea of automation taking over people's lives, you had iRobot coming up in the 40s already before this. It wasn't new in sci-fi, and iRobot in particular meant that it wasn't a concept that hadn't been explored in a mature way beforehand. But I think Vonnegut still manages to strike a few particular points that are quite original and don't really come up anywhere else. So some of those, I think there's stuff about how the world is governed. There's stuff about how the propaganda reinforces the vision of those who have control over this system. And yeah, there's a lot about the personal feelings of the characters who have to deal with all of this. Because if you want to compare this to iRobot, right, as I've said in a video before, Isaac Asimov does not do characters particularly well. Kurt Vonnegut generally does. I think this novel is actually one of his weakest for characters, as I'll come to in a moment. But he writes them with a lot more personality, and that they feel real, and it feels like real people's reactions to these situations, which you don't really get in as many places elsewhere. So I think, the ideas definitely have value. What brought it down for me, I think, it's not necessarily the way it was conventional in that it was written. It was just a bit amateurish. I can't stand anywhere and say that anything Kurt Vonnegut ever wrote was an amateurish piece of writing. But there's some aspects of this that do feel quite rough around the edges. And the characters, as I said, are one aspect. So I found some of the characters in this very annoying. There's one character in particular who just seems to say exactly the same thing in every scene they're in. It's just like, I think you should do this because I think it's good. And then the other character says, no, that good thing is actually bad. You're brainwashed. It's like, yeah, we get it, Kurt. You're just hitting the hammer on our head over and over again now. So it did feel a lot of that. There's a lot of vignettes of people's experiences that kind of all drove home the same point. And it did get tired after a while. So that did bring it down a bit. I think the ending is actually very, very good. Even by, as I've said before, Vonnegut seems to bring a lot of these books together in the ending, even the ones I didn't like as much. I think Player's Piano's ending is actually, really quite good. It's really quite poignant the way it's a bit of a letdown in some ways, but I think that's kind of the point. And I really liked that. So I really appreciated Player Piano. I could tell. So it was written after Kurt Vonnegut spent some time working at General Electric, and you can tell it was a lot of his kind of frustrations with that kind of ecosystem, and that mode of thinking about technology and status within it. And it's a mode of thinking that has not really gone away, and if anything, has only gotten worse since then. So that definitely lined up with a lot of things that I felt were pertinent to the current moment. So, Player Piano. I would like to read it again. I feel like maybe I'd get more out of it the second time, knowing where it's going. It's a bit rare to read a Vonnegut novel without knowing where it's going. It's a B tier for me. I think definitely good, lots of good themes, lots of good ideas, just a bit rough around the edges in the way it's written. But that means that we are now on to A tier. Yes, all of the books from now on are good books. No notes. No, plenty of notes. But yeah, they're good books. Books I would recommend. So let's start in A tier. I've got 6 books in A tier, so I'm going to have to position this correctly. But the least good of these, in my opinion, I'm sorry to say, is Breakfast of Champions. Now, Breakfast of Champions. When I said earlier that a lot of Vonnegut novels are weird, this is probably the weirdest of all. I don't think anyone will disagree on that. It is extremely silly. A lot of it is told kind of with a gimmick of Vonnegut doing a drawing instead of actually describing what's going on. And a lot of these drawings are of, they're crude in both senses of the word. So it's a very provocative novel. It has the kind of this conceit throughout that everything's being explained to an alien. So it's explaining things about the world, things about the United States that Vonnegut has decided are weird when you really think about it. And he's explaining them in a way that kind of highlights their weirdness. So there's one example early on that really got me, which was he quotes the Pledge of Allegiance. No, it's not Pledge of Allegiance. The national anthem of the United States, and then afterwards just says, "This is nobody understands what this means. This is the most incomprehensible set of words ever put together." And something about that just broke me, and I just laughed so much. So it's very funny. It's very silly, very funny. If I could actually explain what goes on in the book. There we go. It is a meeting between a Pontiac dealer named Dwayne Hoover and a science fiction writer named Kilgore Trout. Kilgore Trout appears in lots of Vonnegut novels. He's, I think, already appeared in... Yeah, he was in Hocus Pocus, he was in Jailbird, he's in Breakfast of Champions. So it's kind of, Kilgore Trout across the Vonnegut verse in a way. He has slightly different features in each of his appearances. This is no exception. So the Kilgore Trout that's in this book is not the Kilgore Trout that's in some of the others. But Kilgore Trout is in many ways, and Vonnegut has confirmed this, it's his stand-in, right? It's his alter ego in the stories. But then Breakfast of Champions does something very weird, right? So it's got Dwayne Hoover, it's got Kilgore Trout, who you think is Vonnegut's alter ego in this novel, and is going to be kind of the stand-in for Vonnegut in this novel. And then Vonnegut turns up in the novel as well and starts describing his experiences with the characters he has created. And it says, "Oh, these are all characters I've created. They're all doing the things I've told them to do." So it's just incredibly meta, and I really like that. It's even so forth in that, so that the meeting between Dwayne Hoover and Kilgore Trout, Kilgore Trout gives Dwayne a book he has written that tells the reader that they are the only real person in the universe and everyone else is a robot. So then he does that, and then Kurt Vonnegut turns up in his own story to tell Kilgore Trout, "No, actually you're all robots. I created you." And it's wonderful. It's wonderfully silly. It's great. I do want to recount one other anecdote about this before we actually speak about some of its other attributes. So I read the majority of Breakfast of Champions on a train through Switzerland, because I read a lot of these books while I was on holiday a couple of months ago. And I read this on a train through Switzerland, and it was a train that was ultimately going to end up in Germany. I got off it before it went to Germany, but I think it went as far as Frankfurt and so on. And there's a part in Breakfast of Champions where it describes the way that chemicals affected Germany as a whole, and the psyche of Germany as a whole, into believing bad things, obviously Nazism and so forth. And so I was reading about that, I turned the page, and all of a sudden there's a massive drawing of a swastika on the page. So I, on this train full of German-speaking people, had to close the book extremely quickly, and felt quite embarrassed. I don't think any of them saw, but it was an extra layer of hilarity and weirdness on top of what the book already is. So I think a lot of people think Breakfast of Champions is their favourite, and I think that's quite a valid opinion. It's very Vonnegut in the extreme, in that everything happens in a strange order. Lots of stuff happens that's not explained. It's extremely meta. It's trying to make you laugh at every opportunity by making light of very serious things, and also, just the state of the United States of America. So it is, in that sense, it is quintessential Vonnegut. Unfortunately for me, it was just a bit too silly for its own good. It was yeah, it did a lot of. Yeah, I'm sorry for using the word weird, but it was just weird. It was just weird, and it was too silly, and the plot was quite thin. It kept building towards this one meeting. So I've not spoiled anything by saying that the meeting between these two characters happens, and one of them then reads this novel by Kilgore Trout and starts believing that everyone except him is a robot, because that's all explained in like the first chapter, and then we spend the rest of the story just with Kilgore Trout and with Dwayne Hoover reaching that conclusion. And there's it takes a lot of diversions. There's a lot of things that I feel might not have been necessary in it. But maybe a lot of it is kind of the point, in that it's just making the point that there are a lot of diversions to life. So I don't know. It's definitely a good book, and I would recommend it as a Vonnegut novel. I think as I said, it's too silly for its own good. It's definitely Vonnegut trying to break free of a lot of his own chains in a way that is perhaps a bit unwise in some cases. And I've said all of this that's silly and so on. That's not to say it doesn't cover some serious and important topics. So there's a lot about race relations in here. There's stuff about suicide, and the reactions of people who know people who have committed suicide and so on. So there's serious topics to it, and it tells it all in a very silly way, but it's not necessarily dismissing the seriousness of those ideas. So it's not. I was about to say it's not offensive when I said there was a page with a drawing of a huge swastika on it. I think it is. It is offensive without being offensive. Is the way I'd say it. So yeah, it's Breakfast of Champions. It's silly. If any of the things I've described are taking your interest, then I think you should read it and make up your own mind. But yeah, it was strange. All right, what is next in A tier? Well, for me, it would have to be Deadeye Dick. Deadeye Dick. And this perhaps, I know some people, some Vonnegut aficionados, feel that Deadeye Dick is one of their favourites and is unquestionably S tier. And I can see where they're coming from, but there are some reasons that this doesn't quite hit as well for me. So yeah, but we'll see if I can go into them. So Deadeye Dick is the story of Rudy Waltz, who is the son of some Germanic immigrants to the United States, to Midland City, Ohio, which is incidentally where a lot of the events of Breakfast of Champions take place. And it describes an event in his youth that was accidental, but nonetheless caused a lot of suffering, and kind of his reaction to that and the guilt he felt for the rest of his life. In a way, there's really only like 2 or 3 events of consequence in the novel. It's a weird thing to say, but most of the rest of the novel is living in the reaction to that and feeling the effects of it, seeing how the world has affected how you go through life, kind of going through life knowing that everyone knows this about you, knowing that you will never be redeemed in their eyes, and then ultimately learning to let go of it and move on. To some extent, it's not entirely there. But I think I was going to rate Deadeye Dick lower, actually, because it definitely felt that there's definitely a very depressing tone to a lot of it. And as I said, there's not a lot that happens. Unlike some of the other stories, I found the recounting of some of the characters' backstories very entertaining in this. So I think, in particular, Rudy was his father. His life story was very entertaining, I found. But there still wasn't a lot happening, and it still felt a bit static for a lot of it. But then, once again, we got to the ending, and everything made sense, and the last few chapters really explained what was going on. And I feel like I'd like to explain the effect that had on me and how that led to me placing this a bit higher on my list. But unfortunately, that probably spoils the point of the whole novel. So I don't think I can really say much about this without giving too much away. But yeah, as I said, I know lots of people find this their favourite Vonnegut novel or one of their favourites. I know some people who just can't get into it. It seems a bit divisive in that way. I was somewhere in the middle. I can see where the people who like it are coming from. I think it has a lot of good attributes, and the characters were really well fleshed out. We got to experience the setting of Midland City. That was well fleshed out as well. And the backstories were all good and entertaining, as I said. But yeah, it was a difficult read at times, I think. Partly because it dealt with quite dark subject matter, and partly because it was still quite slow, and just living in the reaction to those events. So yeah, there's not really much I can say about Dead-Eye Dick, I'm afraid, except that I have put it in A tier, just above Breakfast of Champions. So yeah, let's move on. The next book, though, is one that I could say an awful lot about if you gave me the time and the permission to give you spoilers. But somehow it's ended up in about the same place in the rankings, and that is Galapagos. So what happens in Galapagos? Well, what happens in Galapagos is a cruise to the Galapagos Islands just goes wrong in every conceivable way, and probably lots of ways that you couldn't conceive as well. And it's very heavy on the theme. Again, there's definitely a point that Vonnegut is trying to make a lot. And it's not as annoyingly done as something like Play a Piano. There are other themes that are woven in, but it's grumpy. It's definitely him having a bone to pick with a lot of things. And one of those things is evolution. So that was the subject matter that really appealed to me as noted evolution, prehistory aficionado, and so forth. And it was taking a very dim view of evolution as a concept. It wasn't like saying that it's untrue or anything, but it's kind of exploring what evolution, the existence of evolution by natural selection, means for us as humans, as individuals. And the central question really is a big human brain actually that useful as an evolutionary device? Is it a good survival mechanism? Is it going to be going to persist into the future? And that was a really interesting perspective to me, and it's not one that I'm unfamiliar with. And the brutality of evolution is something that I think often gets ignored a lot. That the question, how did the giraffe get its neck, could probably be answered with millions of giraffes with shorter necks died. And it's that kind of it's that kind of thought process about it, and deciding that nature really just doesn't care about humanity, that I found interesting. It was definitely a thought-provoking book, and it would have been a higher ranked book if not for, again, the structure of it. And I think this, more than any other book on this list, really suffered from Vonnegut giving away the ending too early. So I'll still try not to give away any of the ending, but it becomes obvious even within the first few chapters how it's going to end. And of course, he feeds you more information about the missing pieces and so on. But I think the pieces he left until last were not necessarily the more interesting parts of that. And I think he should have. Well, who am I to say? Again, who am I to say what Kurt Vonnegut should or shouldn't have done? But I would have liked it more if it was more conventionally structured, in that everything that happens at the end comes as more of a surprise. Because there's enough thematic build up to it that I think it would have worked anyway. It's not a massive left turn or anything. So yeah, it kind of took a lot of the life out of it in a way to kind of have this conclusion just be spoiled for you straight away. And I was quite sad about that. It's still an entertaining book, and as I said, the theme is still really resonated with me. And also, another just personal anecdote about this. So this was written in 1985, and viewers of the channel will know that there was some big event that was happening around the subject of evolution and extinction in the 1980s. And you'll be happy to know that there is, a page or two of this that discusses asteroids and extinction by asteroids, and particularly the extinction of the dinosaurs by asteroids. So, that was a little Easter egg just for me that was in there, which is nice. But yeah, I really like the Galapagos, but I just wish it hadn't given away all of its secrets straight away, because it could have been a great book. And as it stands, it's still a very good book. It's still an A tier, but I wish it had been better. Moving on. So the next one in A tier for me is God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater. And I should preface this by saying that I think I read the majority of God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater on the shore of an Italian lake. So that might have influenced my experience reading it quite a bit. But this was just a book I really enjoyed. I found it really funny. I really connected with the characters. It seemed to have interesting things to say about economics and politics within the United States. It's relatively simple as far as Vonnegut goes. It's just the story of a couple of people and this one problem. But it felt really well done, and I found it so entertaining. So what happens in God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater? So there is a senator, Senator Rosewater, who is in ownership of this very large sum of money, and he has a son, Elliot Rosewater, who is not living up to his expectations as a son. He's just kind of laying about, trying to help people in need, but perhaps in a not very efficient way. So he's obsessed with the volunteer fire department, which that was a really funny aspect of this for me. It's the story of a lawyer who tries to get this fortune that Elliot Rosewater is supposed to inherit, get this fortune and give it to someone else, and in doing so, take a cut for himself. So I think in the first chapter, it explains that the main character in this story is a large sum of money. And I think, that's an interesting way to look at it. I think Elliot Rosewater is still a very interesting main character. He still serves as the main character quite well. And it's a really good look at kind of the responsibilities of wealthy people. It's a look at philanthropy. A lot of politics is in it. As I said, it was funny without feeling like it needed to try too hard to be funny. A bit like, Breakfast of Champions was hilarious, but it was definitely trying extremely hard at every opportunity to be so. God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, at least to me, felt funny, but a bit less effortful. It was just effortlessly funny. There's just one example that sticks in my mind. The Senator Rosewater tries to define... he tries to come up with a robust, rigid definition of obscenity. And he is patting himself on the back and said, "Oh, yeah, I'm the first person ever to come up with this definition. The first person ever to finally find a way that we can ban the things that we want to ban and keep the things that actually have artistic merit." And it's just, I won't spoil what it actually is, but I just found it hilarious. It's that kind of thing that Vonnegut just peppers his stories with. They're not necessarily like the focal point of anything, but they just feel so that they back up what he's saying so well, and it's a fun experience to read those kind of things. So, God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater. It's simple, but it's entertaining. It's fun. I think perhaps if you wanted to go into Vonnegut with a conventional story, I think this might be a good one. Come to think of it, actually, it is one of the few stories that does not spoil its own ending at any point, I don't think. It's actually told in a linear fashion pretty much all the way through. And the ending... Actually, that is a point. So this... Unfortunately, I do have to say that the ending was a bit of a letdown. It just felt like a slight cop-out to me. I could see how it made sense, and I can see how it resolved the conflicts of everything in a thematically relevant way. But it felt like it came a bit out of nowhere, and it did make the ending fall a bit flat to me. Up until that point, though, I was having a blast with this book. So, I'm happy to recommend it, happy to put it in A tier. And that was God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater. Next up, and we're getting to the start of the really good novels here. So I have put towards the top of A tier. Next one, Mother Night. Mother Night. So Mother Night, I think, is probably one of Vonnegut's most important novels. I think, yeah, as we'll get to, experience and quality wise, it wasn't quite top tier for me. But I think the messages it talks about are, that they're widely shared anyway, and I think rightly so. It's very important in that regard. So what actually happens in Mother Night? It is the story of Howard W. Campbell Jr., who is an American who moves to Germany as it's being taken over by the Nazis, and rises the ranks to become one of their chief propagandists. So he is spreading propaganda on the radio. He is creating iconography that the Nazis are using for propaganda and spreading throughout the world and so on. However, all the time, he is, in fact, a spy for the Americans. He is sending coded messages to them through his radio broadcasts. I found it interesting that the exact way that is coded is never actually explained to us, right? So it's kind of, that's not the important part. The important part to him, and the important part that we're meant to take away from this, is that he was still doing evil things, even though he was ostensibly doing it in service of the United States in the war. And it's important it's important in a few ways. And one of those, I think, is it really predated the codification of the banality of evil. So this was a concept that was applied to many of the higher ups in the Nazi regime, where they were just following orders. That's what they were doing as evil. They were just bureaucrats that resulted in the deaths of many millions of people. And Vonnegut really does explore this in a very effective manner in this novel. And yeah, that was something that was explored in a more academic sense a couple of years later, but Vonnegut was talking about it first. And it's also famous, I think, now for what he describes in, is it a prologue or is it just the preface? I think it's a preface to what was then a later edition of the novel. It wasn't the edition I read. Where he says, a lot of my books don't have morals. I think that's untrue. I think there's definitely some books of his that he is trying to put a moral framework together and push forward on. But he says, this one is the only one I can point to that has a very clear and definite moral. And that is, we are what we pretend to be. I think that's a very powerful statement. I think Vonnegut has phrased it very well. And that's definitely something that has made the rounds. Even today, you'll see it in various places on the internet. And yeah, it's weird to be in the head of a character who is actually quite sympathetic. You definitely feel for this character quite a lot, even though he is doing unquestionably evil things. He's doing those evil things with the ulterior motive that he's actually doing good things behind the scene and trying to win the war for the other side. But he doesn't really feel passionate about that. He doesn't feel passionate about the evil things he's doing. He's just trying to get through life doing them. And focus on the things he really, really cares about, which is love and just feeling content in his life. And yeah, it was very powerful in that regard. So, what brought it down, unfortunately for me, is it's just extremely dark. Even by the standards of some of Vonnegut's other novels, the content it discusses is, as you would imagine, being about Nazis and Nazi propaganda. It's dark. There's a lot of death and a lot of desensitization to the death that happens in the novel. And it was an unpleasant read in that regard. So I think this probably deserves to be S tier, but I struggled to read it, so I bumped it down slightly. But yeah, I think I would definitely recommend it as a Vonnegut novel to read. As I said, it's definitely one of his more important works. It's one of his most celebrated as well. But yeah, it's not quite at the top tier for me just because it was a difficult one to get through. But yeah, that was Mother Night. And to cap off A tier, before we get to the really, really good ones, I am going to put Bluebeard. Bluebeard goes in there. So Bluebeard is the story of Rabo Karabekian, who is a second-generation Armenian immigrant to the United States, and he becomes a famous abstract artist who is then disgraced in the art world and has to find meaning in his artistic merit again. And I think, the subject matter is something quite interesting. It's about creating meaningful art. And what does it mean to create art with soul versus art that is original? Or, is it easy or is it hard or, whatever. And I think Vonnegut is in a very interesting position to write something from that perspective, because although he's not an artist, he is an artist actually. He's sold many of his prints, but they're usually just like simple line drawings. But he has written novels that are conventional. He's written novels that are very out there. And it's interesting to see his own perspectives on how he weighs the value of each of those. So that was really good. I really connected with that. And I think the characters themselves in this novel are really good as well. So the main conceit is that it is written as an autobiography by Rabo Karabekian, spurred on by this woman he meets called Circe Berman. And there's some criticism, some of it justified, some of it I don't think is quite justified, of the way that Vonnegut has written female characters in his previous novels. I think, earlier on in his career, there were some aspects of that I think were probably true, if some criticism to be levelled against him. But he clearly developed in that way, and I think Circe Berman in this story is probably the best female character in any of his novels, and she's a really good character. So she comes along, she tries to, get the secrets out of this old man who once was a famous artist and is now just living a contented life on Long Island, I believe. She comes along, tries to get him to write his autobiography. And at first, the narrative voice is just kind of playing with it. He doesn't take it seriously. So that's enjoyable. And there's this one instance where Circe takes what he has written so far for his autobiography, and then he's writing after the fact what she thought of that, and it gives Vonnegut an opportunity to criticize his own habits when writing, and question his own idiosyncrasies that perhaps many critics would have of his artistic output and so forth. And that was just the perfect level of meta. And I think in general this is this plays with meta stuff, but it doesn't go too far with it. And I think that's the perfect level. And it, as I said, the narrative voice is one of the main draws. It's, despite a lot of serious subject matter, it is quite an optimistic book because we're seeing the world through a character who is generally quite, in quite a good mood. And the serious subject matter is serious. So it discusses the Armenian genocide. It discusses the suicides of various other high-profile abstract artists, and what it feels like to go through life losing them along the way. So it's definitely quite, it's a very personal connection to those sorts of things. But it still manages to end on an optimistic note, and it still manages to build up a mystery, which is, again, something that Vonnegut does not do very often. So the ending, we're told there's something in the potato barn that is interesting. But what's in the potato barn? Well, we only have to guess until like the last or second to last chapter or whatever. So that was definitely a mystery. I was guessing along, and I didn't manage to guess it. And in the end, it was something that it made a lot of sense, actually. And I think I should have seen it coming, knowing what I know about Vonnegut and what he's written about in the past. But yeah, it was still an interesting thing to see there. And an interesting commentary on, again, the value of meaningful art and which pieces of art have soul and which pieces don't, and how you could motivate yourself to make art with soul and so on. So yeah, just entertaining book, very interesting subject matter, and really good characters. So that was Bluebeard. Now then, we begin the climb up the sacred steps of S tier. And I think the first entry in S tier is going to ruffle some feathers here. I am going to put Timequake in S tier. Fight me. I didn't see this coming. So, Timequake. People do not generally think of Timequake as one of Kurt Vonnegut's best novels. And I think, some of the rankings I've seen elsewhere even put it as low as some, C or D tier. Or equivalent. But I'm putting Timequake in S tier with a big asterisk I think it is only S tier if you read it last. It only makes sense to go here if it is at the end of a long string of reading Kurt Vonnegut. A bit like, I suppose, a bit like Avengers Endgame, right? It would not make sense on its own, but if it's in context of everything else, it elevates itself and the rest of the stuff that came before it. So, yeah, Timequake, I adore it. I'm sorry. So what actually is Timequake? It's a bit hard to explain. I mean, the description that is given is that between the years 1991 and 2001, that 10-year period, at the end of that 10-year period, the universe experiences a crisis of self-confidence and decides to rewind 10 years. And so everyone has to go through everything they did for the past 10 years all over again. They can see it, they can experience it, but they can't change anything they do. So basically, free will for those 10 years doesn't exist. Your only free will is to react to the way that you acted the first time around, and I guess ponder the questions of life and the meaning of existence. And then, of course, as soon as 2001 rolls around again, free will snaps back into being, and everything just blows up, as you can see on the artwork here. I do quite like this one of the artwork. So Timequake, it was written or at least published in 1997, I think, 97. And it was Vonnegut's last novel, and you can tell that throughout. It's very much a swan song. It's got that kind of feel. I think for a while he was content to leave Hocus Pocus as his last novel in 1990, and then was working on one that didn't quite come together, and decided, you know what, I'll just string together everything I've got and decide to release it into the world as this abomination. And it really is an abomination, right? So that plot I described, that everything happened again for the past 10 years, and then everything turned to chaos after those 10 years ended. Out of, I don't know, 180 pages of the novel, that was maybe like 20, 30 pages. The rest of it is basically an autobiography, really. And so if you go into this thinking, I want a Vonnegut novel, I want a story, then you're going to be massively unsatisfied. And I think that's what a lot of people who rate it quite low would, I think that's their perspective on it. Whereas I have enjoyed reading some of Vonnegut's non-fiction stuff. I've enjoyed reading some of his articles. So in the Library of America editions, at the end of each of those volumes, there's a series of his short stories and some of his non-fiction articles and speeches and things. And I think he's very good at writing those kind of things. And I think the first, as I will explain when in the upcoming video essay and so forth, on a novel, which is not Timequake, it's one of the other three, we'll find out. As I will explain in that video essay, I think the first piece of writing I ever read from Kurt Vonnegut was non-fiction. And it was his advice on writing. And even that was just so entertaining. I've often found with a lot of these novels, if I zoom out again to show what we've got so far, with a lot of these novels, paradoxically, they are more effective when they come directly from Vonnegut himself. When he writes either from the perspective of himself or some kind of third-person omniscient being that really is just Vonnegut. And a lot of the time that he tries to have his characters explain the themes of the novel themselves and use them as a mouthpiece, it's not as effective and it comes across a bit cheaper. And I think Timequake is him embracing the opposite of that. It's him just deciding, right, this is me writing. I'm going to write a novel, in inverted commas, that's just about me. And it explains my views on the world. And, to some extent, it is Old Man Yells at Cloud, the novel. So how much can you put up with that? I don't know. When the cloud is a cloud that I have been thinking about quite a bit, then it's definitely one that I connected to in Timequake. But yeah, it's not going to be everyone's cup of tea. So I've put it in S tier, because it is so unique, even compared to some of his other weird meta stuff. Like, it's kind of a spiritual successor to Breakfast of Champions, but it doesn't go as far with the silliness, and I think that helps it. But it's just, yeah, apart from that, it's so unique. It is so Vonnegut. It's just so personal. And I found it, especially at the end of everything, again, as I said, it was actually quite emotionally affecting. And there's a few scenes in this where he describes losing members of his family. And this is not in any kind of fictional setting. This is literally him describing what happened to him in an autobiographical sense. And I started tearing up at those. They were really wonderfully done. And so I love Timequake. It's a minority opinion, but I really like Timequake. I think it deserves to go in S tier. I think if you read a few Vonnegut novels and you find yourself connecting to who Vonnegut is as a person, then I would recommend Timequake. I would absolutely not recommend Timequake as a first thing to read. So if you watch this video and think, oh, I'll just start with the S tier. Let's pick one at random from the S tier. Oh, Timequake, that sounds cool. Don't do that. Don't. You'll only disappoint yourself. But in context of Vonnegut's life and what it means for Vonnegut to have written this and him grappling with his own identity, it's fascinating. It's really fascinating to me. And this is a novel where Kilgore Trout comes back and kind of does the same thing as Breakfast of Champions, where he's a character, but also Vonnegut's a character, and they interact. And Kilgore Trout has been Vonnegut's alter ego so many times, but now you can see him kind of having an argument with himself and seeing, well, there are some aspects of who I present as myself to the world that perhaps I am a bit disappointed in. Perhaps I have doubts about. So some of the old man yells at cloud in this novel comes from Kilgore Trout, and you have to wonder, is that actually Vonnegut anymore, or is it him satirizing his own perspectives on things? So I found Timequake really enjoyable. It was such a fun read, such a fun way to end this going through every Vonnegut novel. So I feel no qualms at all about putting it in S tier, even though I am sure that would be a controversial one. But yeah, that was Timequake. My opinions on the remaining three in S tier, though, I think are going to be a bit less controversial. I think a lot of people have these three as their top three Kurt Vonnegut novels in whatever order. But let's find out what order is particular to me. So what goes above Timequake? Above Timequake, I am putting Cat's Cradle. Cat's Cradle. So, Cat's Cradle is definitely one of Vonnegut's most well-known novels. I think it's only really behind Slaughterhouse-5 in that. It was not, however, one that I had read prior to going through every novel together. So, yeah, this was... I expected it to be good, and it was good. It was very good. And I was speaking to a friend about Vonnegut, and they had read Slaughterhouse-5 and Cat's Cradle, and no others. So I think... Yeah, Cat's Cradle is probably quite a common one for people to have come across, and maybe they know some things about it. But if you don't, Cat's Cradle is the story of a man who initially is trying to write a book about the people involved in the development of the nuclear bomb that was dropped on Japan. But through trying to find out more information about these people, he becomes embroiled in, a new scandal over a new doomsday device that's even worse in many ways. And then he ends up on a tropical island that's got a mad dictator, and the population of the island believe a very strange religion that's contradictory all over the place. And it's got a lot of really interesting ideas, and I think a lot of really original ideas as well. So the main thing it's satirizing is the Cuban Missile Crisis, obviously, because it's all about the development of ever more powerful weapons without the thought of how they're going to be used, and the social implications of them. And it's a lot about, what is science's role in that? Should science do things just for the search for truth, or should it consider the social implications of what could come from it, and so on? And I think this was something that Vonnegut changed his mind on, actually, after having read through all of these novels. Because in Player Piano, he specifies that it is not the scientist's fault for creating the technology that's able to run the world. It is the managers and the engineers who just take it and decide to use it as they see fit. Whereas in Cat's Cradle, the blame is definitely laid at the feet of the scientists themselves. There's this one character, Felix Honecker, I think, who is the man that he seeks out initially as the man involved in the development of the nuclear bomb, who just seems, he's portrayed in every case as extremely absent-minded and just seems to care about doing science and doesn't care about the wider context of it. And Vonnegut is extremely critical of that in Cat's Cradle. And he uses as a method to contrast that the religion of the island of San Lorenzo, which is called Baconanism. And Baconanism is very strange. It is purposefully self-contradictory in almost every way. And it's Vonnegut creating a satire of religion. But you come out of it thinking maybe there's something in that, right? He's asking, well, it's all about the harmless untruths that religion teaches people that nonetheless help keep them together and help give them purpose in life. And then he uses that to contrast the harmful truths that come out of science. So I don't think he really comes to a conclusion on it. He's definitely critical of both, I think. It probably comes down more on the side against science in a weird way. Even though Vonnegut says he spends a lot of time around scientists, and his older brother was a scientist, and he studied, various scientific subjects. It's extremely critical of science, really, as a method of improving the world, without the context of the humans who are going to have to deal with it. So I thought, the subject matter was just fascinating. It was really thought-provoking in the way it did that. Baconanism is absurd, but in a really attractive way. It's just thought-provoking. It creates a lot of questions in your mind. And that's not even touching on the way it's written. So it's the extreme of Vonnegut's style of writing very short chapters. So I think there are some cases where there were chapters that were less than a page long, and there were like multiple chapter headings on the same page. So it was intensely readable. You just got through half of it before you even realized it. And it was a bit of a slow start. It took a while to get going, but as it ramped up, it was like adding on all of these new elements, this world building that he'd created. It just kept building and building. And he gave away some of the future in, as I said, the usual Vonnegut way. He's speaking from the perspective of the character after everything has happened. And he gives away some of the future, but he doesn't give away too much, such that when you actually get to the grand, amazing conclusion, it definitely feels like a grand, amazing conclusion. And even though, I felt like I thought that was where it was going, but it still felt like a surprise to see exactly how it happened. And I think that's like, he managed the balance of that perfectly in this novel. And this novel is also responsible for giving us one of the most iconic doomsday devices in all of science fiction, that being Ice 9. And Ice 9 comes out of a general's request to the scientist to create some method to deal with mud. So he says that his troops have just spent so much time trying to squelch through mud, and it just makes warfare really hard and really dirty and annoying. And he's like, come on, scientist, invent me a way to deal with mud. And then Honecker goes away and he invents Ice 9, which is a new state of matter for ice, which, if it's based around a seed crystal, and if that seed crystal and any ice connected to it are introduced to water in any fashion, then it turns all of that into Ice 9. And Ice 9 it's like ice, but it has a melting point of, I think, 50 degrees Celsius. So basically, it has the potential to destroy all the water on Earth, which, it's terrifying, and it comes across as terrifying in the novel. And I think it is rightfully quite an iconic thing that's come out of Vonnegut's novels, this Ice Nine. Just, the juxtaposition between the silliness of its creation and the power that it wields it's iconic, really. So yeah, I really like Cat's Cradle. I think it is, objectively one of his best novels. I think I like the other two that are coming up more. I think they connected to me a bit more, even though obviously the themes of this connected to me quite a lot. But I think it is absolutely worthy of the S tier, and I don't think there will be much disagreement in that. So we are now down to the final two. And these, interestingly enough, are the two that I read before I went through all of Vonnegut's novels in the past 6 months. So I did go back and reread them, just so I could see, get my thoughts straight on where they fit in between everything. So yeah, I guess it's time to find out which of them comes first and which comes second. So which of these is the second greatest Vonnegut novel, in my opinion? It's the big one. It's Slaughterhouse-5. Here we go. Slaughterhouse-5. So I read Slaughterhouse-5 for the first time, I think, 7-8 years ago. And I fell in love with it then. And in a terrible lapse of judgment, I forgot to just follow up on that with reading any other Kurt Vonnegut for so long. So yeah, for many years, I would say that Slaughterhouse-5 was one of my favourite books, and it still is. It's definitely up there. And I remember specifically how I came across it. And it was on YouTube, as many things are these days. And I saw in the suggested videos of something from Crash Course, the Crash Course by the Green Brothers. And it was the Crash Course literature episode on Slaughterhouse-5. And it was billed as, I don't know, time travel, aliens, and PTSD or something. And I thought, that's a very strange combination of things, but I like time travel. I like aliens. I want to read this now. So obviously I watched the video and saw the analysis of that. And then I went and read the book and loved the book. And only now have I gone back and read the rest of Kurt Vonnegut. So yeah, big mistake on my part there. But anyway, Slaughterhouse-5. Slaughterhouse-5 is about a man who was a veteran of World War II who may or may not have PTSD. It's debated. And perhaps or perhaps not as a symptom of that PTSD, experiences all of his life out of order, including and up to being abducted by aliens and kept hostage on an alien planet with a porn star to keep him company. So it's this. I think it's interesting, right, to compare this and contrast it with Slapstick, because as I said way back in Slapstick is a lot of weird things that don't seem to fit together, and they don't fit together. Whereas Slaughterhouse-5, for whatever reason, for reasons I don't quite understand, it's a lot of things that don't fit together, and yet they do. They really do so much. And Slaughterhouse-5 really was the start of Vonnegut's explorations of metafiction, I think. So it is quite famously based on his own experiences in World War II. So the main character, Billy Pilgrim, experiences the firebombing of Dresden and has to deal with that as it comes out of the war. And even the very first, chapter of the novel is Vonnegut talking about, how am I going to present the war, and who is this character going to be that is, leading people through the story. Is he going to be a big action hero, or is he just a child? And the reason for that is that Billy Pilgrim's experiences with Dresden are based on Vonnegut's own experiences with Dresden. So he was a prisoner of war during World War II, captured by the Germans. He was taken to Dresden, and he was there when it was firebombed by the Allies. and he only survived by hiding out in a meat cellar, which was Slaughterhouse 5. And so Billy Pilgrim goes through the same thing, along with a lot of things that presumably did not happen to Kurt Vonnegut, as far as we know. And yeah, it's his first exploration of metafiction. It's his first really personal novel, and I think looking back on this, on having read all the novels, I think there's definitely kind of a pyramid shape to it, at least as far as Vonnegut's opinions of his own writing go, where he was for a long time building up to Slaughterhouse 5. Like he was drip feeding in themes from it. So, what is it? So, Mother Night is obviously a lot about the Second World War. God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater features Kilgore Trout. It features Elliot Rosewater having a hallucination about the firebombing of Dresden. And various other novels do similar things. So it felt like he was trying to write this novel for a long time and sneaking bits of it into other novels because he felt like maybe I never will, and was worried about that. And yet he did manage to pull it all together, and he created Slaughterhouse 5, and that gained quite massive success for him. It became a household name, and then after that he was just kind of figuring out what to do with his life now that he'd achieved it. And a lot of his remaining novels, so even Breakfast of Champions, which came immediately after, that feels like an intentional departure from Slaughterhouse 5 to try something else, because he's been stuck on the themes of Slaughterhouse 5 for so long. So Breakfast of Champions was try to do something else. Dead-Eye Dick is all about, what is the story of someone's life, and it's the guilt, the experience of having already done something and just living through the reaction of it. I think probably applies to Vonnegut when it comes to Slaughterhouse 5 as well, because it was, in a lot of people's opinion, his magnum opus, and I think they're very justified in deciding that it is his magnum opus. And then for the rest of his writing career, he was left wondering, what on earth do I do? So that's how big of an impact this novel had, and it is that good. So the main gimmick, I won't call it a gimmick because it's done extremely effectively and extremely iconically, but the main gimmick of it is that it's all told completely out of order, to mimic the way that Billy Pilgrim is experiencing the world. And it somehow comes together. He somehow managed to order everything in a way that makes sense and comes to a sensible conclusion and an affecting conclusion. And I remember the first time I read this, I cried at the end, right? It's him trying to find, the purpose of life when all of the world just seems to be so dark. And I think he definitely hit that nail on the head better in Slaughterhouse 5 than anything else. What else is there to say about Slaughterhouse 5? There's a lot to say about Slaughterhouse 5. So I guess one of the most iconic parts of Slaughterhouse 5 is 3 words. It's a 3-word phrase, so it goes. And this is, Vonnegut's motif. He repeats it whenever a character in Slaughterhouse 5 dies. And character extends to quite a lot of things. I think there's some machinery at one point that fails, and he uses the word "so it goes." A whole civilization is wiped out or something at some point, and he says "so it goes." It's a really, really effective writing technique where at first it's just like weird, like you notice it every time it happens, and then it starts becoming annoying. Like, oh God, I've dealt with this so much. Stop trying to be silly, Kurt. Just stop it. And then it just blends into the background, and you don't even notice it anymore. And it is such a beautiful way to describe his own experience of seeing, so much death in World War II and trying to come to terms with it. It definitely deserves yeah, it deserves the fame, so it goes, that it has. I think it's just such a condensation of his ability to make precise his feelings about the world. And that's true in a lot of these books. I think even in the worst ones, there are cases where Kurt Vonnegut manages to be very precise in his language and come up with an interesting phrase or a new way of looking at something that is original and it's perceptive and it's affecting. And Slaughterhouse-Five really is, again, one of the apexes of that. What else can I say about Slaughterhouse-Five? I realise I've been talking about this one for a long time. I mean, it deserves it. The Child Thamidorians in Slaughterhouse-Five are the aliens who see all of time at once and allow Billy Pilgrim to also see all of time at once after he's been in their company for a while. And there's another story about aliens that see all of time at once and convince a human of seeing time that way as well. And I think this one did it a bit better, just because it was a lot more lighthearted and managed to laugh at a lot of things as well. It's also extremely crude, which is why it has been banned many times. There's a couple of drawings in it of the level of Breakfast of Champions in provocativeness, perhaps. But I think it's really all of that together is the human experience, and I think no other book of his really combines all of that in this kind of way, and I think that is why Slaughterhouse-Five has attained really the recognition that it has, and yeah, I think it deserves it. It absolutely deserves it. But it is not my favourite. It is not my favourite Kurt Vonnegut novel. Not quite. So, the second of the books that I had read before I decided to go on this crusade to experience all of Vonnegut, the one that inspired me to read all of his books, and the one that I am making a video essay on, is The Sirens of Titan. And, Sirens of Titan. It's just so good. It also has the best artwork of all of this collection, I have to say. And it gets even better once you've read the book and you understand what's meant by all of these bits. What can I say about Sirens of Titan? I could speak for a long time about the Sirens of Titan, and I probably will in the video that's coming. So let me just try and explain, I guess, the plot. A very rich and influential man from Earth named Winston Niles Rumford. In the near future, this is set at an indeterminate point in the near future, he flies a spaceship into, I guess the way I think of it is like a wormhole, but it's called a chronosynclastic infundibulum, which is a very fun phrase to say. But Winston Niles Rumford flies a spaceship into a chronosynclastic infundibulum, and what that does, it stretches him out across all of time and space, and he can then see everything that's ever going to happen. And he uses his new position in, it could be compared to godhood, and that's definitely a recurring theme in this book. He uses this position to influence the development of humanity in certain ways. But I won't get into that too much for fear of spoiling it. But really, the story isn't about Winston Niles Rumford. It's about a character called Malachi Constant, who is the richest man on Earth, who is kind of sent on a series of tortures by this now omniscient, omnipotent being in Winston Niles Rumford. He's sent on a quest across the solar system for unknown reasons, and has to suffer through all of these trials and tries to find meaning of it all. And there's just so much about this book that works. It is so funny in so many places, but it still hits extremely hard. It has a lot of heart to it. The plot is tight. The pacing of it is by far, I think, the best of any of his novels. It's perhaps a bit slow to start off, but actually, when I read it through the second time, I understood what was going on, and I could see all the symbolism of what all of that meant. So So I will not judge that a criticism. I think it has the perfect pacing, and it made me cry twice. There are two events in this book that caused me to cry. One of them was the ending, and another was when one of the characters, how can I say this without spoiling too much? One of the characters finds his purpose on another planet. Okay. And the themes of the Sirens of Titan, it's another one of those ones like Slaughterhouse 5 where there's so many themes kind of rushing past you at once, and yet it somehow clumps together. It's somehow coherent, and the themes, some of them really resonated with me. And like, as I said, earlier, this is one where the shape of the themes of the stories just like slotted perfectly into the shape of my brain. And I was like, yes, I understood what's going on here. I'm sure there's lots that, it's a very dense book thematically. I'm sure there's lots to it that I don't understand, and I will endeavor to fix that as I work on the video on it. But yeah, it's just certain parts of it just worked for me and spoke to me so well. The themes about there's themes on art, technology, ambition, progress, and then some of the other themes, religion, war. It just kind of ties all of them together somehow in a way that, I'm not going to say it's coherent, because a lot of people come out of the Sirens of Titan feeling extremely confused. Like, I've looked up some of the reviews on Amazon and people are like completely missing the point of it. And again, this is a very subjective ranking. I would, I'd be disappointed if someone didn't get these experiences out of the Sirens of Titan, but it's their experience of it. But yeah, for me, it distilled so many ideas in such a perfect way that I have no choice but to put it at the top here. It's not my favorite book. I think that title still belongs to A Darkling Plane, which some members of my subscriber base may remember from long ago. I think I can feel confident in saying it's my second favorite book ever, The Sirens of Titan. So, but what else can I say without spoiling too much or without covering ground that I will cover in the video? I think, Vonnegut has stated on several occasions that this was the only book of his that he enjoyed writing, which is a bit sad. But yeah, he said he had so many crazy ideas for it and just like hashed them out all together, and it just came together perfectly. It was his perfect baby, and I think that shows. I think that there's a level of energy to it and a level of passion to it that is not missing from his other novels, but it's more prominent here, and it has more of an effect here. The Sirens of Titan. I'm sorry, I'm just going to keep going on about this for a while for the rest of the video. The plot is, it doesn't give itself away, although it kind of does if you're paying attention. And I think it's one of those ones where the narrative voice is so tricksy, like you start to distrust the narrative voice, even though the narrative voice is just a third person, omniscient person in the future. It's like, well, some of the things you're saying don't really equate with what I'm seeing happening in the world. And that leads me to question some of the other things you've said. And that is really effective as well. And you notice that, the narrative is playing tricks on you. And on the second read through, I realized, it does give its ending away, but only if you're paying very close attention. And I was not, clearly, the first time I read it. I remember the first time I read it, I was on a train and I finished it on a train, and I was zombified right afterwards for the remainder of the trip back. I was just like, walking through stations on complete autopilot, because this has just completely knocked me out, really. And maybe like some other stories here, some other books here, the circumstances in which I read it possibly had an effect on how much I rate it, but I think I would have fallen in love with it anyway. So that's the Sirens of Titan. I will leave all other discussion of it until the video. And as I said, that video is it's in the works, but it's going to be another big one. I'm going to try and get some more videos out in between, I think. Some smaller ones, a bit less ambitious scale. Because this one is I say the only bits of it I've got so far are bits of script. I've also got some on-location filming in various interesting locations, which you'll have to find out. But yeah, it's that kind of speaks to the level of how intimidating this video is for me at the moment. But I'll get through it. It may be a few months away. I apologise, but yeah, that's just how it works. Well then, here we are. Every Kurt Vonnegut novel ranked. Thank you very much for sticking with me if you have been here this whole time. I think, yeah, it's been an interesting adventure, this journey through all of Vonnegut's novels, and I think if you watch this far, you probably have favourites of your own, so I'm very interested to hear what those are. I'm especially interested to hear why some of the ones that I perhaps have rated a bit more towards the bottom, if they're some of your favourites, then I'd like to know why, and perhaps that could help me, understand why they didn't connect with me as much, or see what I'm missing in them. Because I want to see the best of each of Kurt Vonnegut's novels, and some of them I certainly have. I'm very happy to have gone through this, but I do need to read something else now. I did get a bit fed up of some Vonnegut isms towards the end, as you can probably tell. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. As I said, there will be the Sirens of Titan video coming at some point. There will be other videos hopefully happening in between. If the information I have on a certain multi-dimensional board game is accurate, then there may be one coming later this week. So you could probably look forward to that. Someone should play that, and someone maybe has played it. We'll see. But yeah, thank you very much for watching. I will see you next time.